So something I really hate, although I have yet to come up with a good term for it, is when people will use a universal, unqualified rhetorical statement to try to emotionally manipulate people. And then if you call them on it and you ask them to explain it or how it applies in a particular situation, they'll try to gaslight you, or they'll say that's not what you mean, or only a stupid person would think that when I use the word all, it means all. The word all means all, but except for these exceptions, or something like that. And I just really hate that. I just find it very slimy. I don't like being gaslit. I don't like people who try to screw around with objective reality. Now, I find this is very common with the current narrative regarding mass shootings in the United States. And you can correct me in the comments section if I'm misrepresenting these people or I'm strawmanning them. But generally speaking, for the last couple decades, and in particular in the last couple of years, what I tend to hear are things like the following. America is the only country where mass shootings happen. America has a uniquely violent gun culture. Mass shootings are an American phenomenon. They happen there far more than anywhere else in the world. And you could just go through any number of others, but at the end of the day, there's an attempt to make it seem like gun violence, particularly the concept of a mass shooting, is something that only happens in America. And those who will admit it doesn't happen only in America, but happens other places, will say it's extremely rare in other places. And even if it does happen there, it's because someone is copycatting the United States. So regardless of how you feel about gun regulation, whether there should be more regulation or less regulation or about the same as we have now, I just kind of want to take a second and say, is this really the case? Is America really that uniquely violent in terms of the world? Is mass shootings a uniquely American phenomenon? So let's examine this in the unqualified way in which it's generally presented. Do mass shootings happen anywhere else in the world? Let's think about this a minute. Now, there's a number of countries that are in the middle of insurrections, civil wars, where terrorism is a daily thing, where there's death squads that kill criminals and street children. And the expectation of the media is that none of this counts. That the Russian government shooting civilians in Ukraine, that's not a mass shooting. That doesn't count as a mass shooting. ISIS shooting people in Syria doesn't count as mass shootings. Al-Shabaab and Somalia shooting people doesn't count. The death squads in Colombia don't count. The death squads in Brazil don't count. The death squads in Mexico don't count. The cartels killing each other are not mass shootings. The ongoing Syrian civil war, there's no mass shootings that go on there. So to try to, at the very basis, take this idea that mass shootings only happen in the U.S. is frankly just retarded. I mean, I came up with a dozen different examples right there that I think inherently disproves the idea that mass shootings only happen in the United States. And so this gets into the area where once you call somebody on that statement, and the point is that they're using the statement that mass shootings only happen in America to try to demonize America and to try emotionally manipulate people into doing what they want them to do, despite the fact that they know their statement is not factually correct. So if you call them on it, they will try to say, look, when I said mass shootings, and then they'll start giving you a list of exceptions. So the first one they'll normally get is, I mean non-state related mass shootings. So if it's the Russian government killing civilians in the Ukraine, that does not count as a mass shooting. Stuff like that doesn't count. So they'll normally start with that, and then they'll say, okay, well, politically motivated mass shootings don't count, except for when they do, because they try to blame white supremacism for the ones that happen in America. But they'll say, okay, look, when FARC in Colombia decides to level a village, or ISIS decides to blow some stuff up, or individual Muslims who are radicalized by ISIS indirectly, even though they have no real contact with ISIS, none of that counts as a mass shooting, because that is politically related. And a mass shooting cannot be done by a state actor. It can also not be done for political reasons. And then you'll expand upon this and you're like, okay, well, what about like the drug cartels? The drug cartels massacre each other all the time. You have gangbangers in the US who shoot each other all the time and they have big shootouts. This happens throughout the world. If you look at South Africa, there's mass shootings that happen there like every other day. Chicago has mass shootings on like a weekly basis. But then the definition gets narrowed further. It's like, okay, well, it can't be political except if it's white supremacism. It can't be a state actor. It can't be a religious organization or religiously motivated. It can't be criminal. It has to be, and we're getting into this extremely like narrow thing that almost just by definition couldn't apply anywhere else. But my point is they're using the term mass shooting in a way that the person who hears it thinks any form of mass gun violence. But what they mean, and if they're called on it, they will admit that they mean, is that it's this extremely specific thing. And something very similar to this is the entire concept of a serial killer, which is to me kind of, I don't know, I've heard people try to justify it and say, well, someone who there doesn't have a financial motive, or someone who doesn't have a political motive, or someone who waits in between his targets. Because if you were to look at it, probably the highest, some of the studies I've seen, the highest, the biggest serial killers on earth are like hitmen in Colombia, or guys who carry out hits for cartels. And some of them have killed hundreds of people, but they don't count as serial killers because they're doing it for money, even though, what's his name, H.H. Holmes killed people for money. And lots of serial killers have killed people for money. But that's kind of apparently beside the point. Also, if you're like a gang enforcer and you've killed dozens of people for the gang boss, you don't count as a serial killer either, because that's criminal. That's crime related. Secret police don't count as serial killers. Mafia doesn't. Terrorists don't. And you just kind of get to a scenario where it's like the serial killer is an American phenomenon, but that's achieved by basically excluding like 95% of the people who would be considered a serial killer under a broader definition. And so this kind of long about analysis drill down kind of leads us to our question: are mass shootings, in the sense, the qualified sense of someone without a clear motive, who spontaneously decides to go out and shoot up a school or other mass or other area that's not officially connected with a, or inspired by, I guess, a political or religious movement, who isn't a criminal except for the crime of shooting people, who I can't even define it. I was gonna like try to define it, but I guess I kind of get what they mean. If you're talking about just random teenagers or just random people going up and like shooting up a school or something, in that very specific context, I guess it's worse in America. But once again, like, to get to this, we had to do so many carve-outs and exemptions, and you even have to exclude most of the mass shootings that happen in America itself. Like I said, none of the times where like 19 people get killed in Chicago over the weekend does that count as a mass shooting. Drive-bys where like dozens of, like a bunch of people get shot, that doesn't count as a mass shooting. So like, if by this extremely narrow definition that I can't even really define, because some people say, well, it excludes political stuff, but every time one of these guys does it, they try to say he's a white supremacist, or he's a neo-Nazi, or he's a Republican, or he's a member of some like right-wing organization or something like that. So, I mean, if we're going to be fair, if we're going to say that people who are inspired by ISIS and who commit crimes in the name of ISIS, we can't count them as serial killers or mass shooters because they have a political motivation. If we're going to say that these white kids are also motivated by white supremacism, we can't really say they're mass shooters either by the same token. Maybe they just mean like mass shooters inspired by a very specific narrow political ideology. But even then, they'll take people with no discernible motive, or even people who have left wing ideas, and they'll say that they're also like it. So, is like mass shootings, if we're just going to use the most general definition of the term, more common in America than the rest of the developed world? Probably. The only country, if you want to consider a developed country, where they might be more common is Israel. But that once again, that depends on whether you count terrorism and sectarian conflict and stuff like that as being a form of mass shooting. If we're going to say none of that is, then yes, it is probably higher in America. Most forms of violent crime are higher in America. I can't really think of another developed country that has a crime rate, violent crime rate as high as the U.S. And that's probably because large parts of the U.S. are not a developed country. The developed parts of the U.S., I think, are fairly similar to Europe, if not maybe slightly higher. So I think I made my point as much as I can. I'm trying to deal with a very slippery, elusive, difficult to define concept here. But my point being that the term mass shooting is so like qualified and so misused, it is really hard to even look at the discussion. And before you have anyone like talk about how to reduce mass shootings or something, you got to get them to like identify or explain what they even mean by that. Because frankly, I don't even really know. It's too difficult to describe. And so kind of the approach a lot of people seem to be doing is we have to stop mass shootings by banning guns, and they don't even really know what a mass shooting is, because the definition is so like gerrymandered and so pigeonholed and stuff like that, that it's not particularly useful from a political perspective. So sorry if that's confusing, but hopefully that made sense and you found that interesting. I'll talk to you guys soon.